Good morning, everyone, or good evening. It's evening for us. I assume it's morning for you. My name is Jonas, and I'll be your presenter for today. I do hope that you had a blast working with Pixtope so far with Frank on the first two sessions. And I hope that you are equally excited about today's session, which is going to be about virtual studios. Next to me here, I have my good colleague Magnus, which is going to be operating the cameras and making sure the stream is running nice and smoothly. We hope that you all are doing well during this troublesome time, and we are very happy that we are able to bring you this webinar despite the circumstances. So without further ado, I think we can just jump right into the session and start with some slides. So first, a quick introduction about myself. Once again, my name is Jonas Pechan. I'm a CG artist at the Future Group. Been working here for about 2 years now and been doing on-site creative support for a number of Pixitope productions throughout the world. And I came in here with a background as a hard surface modeling and texturing artist. But enough about me, let's talk about Pixitope. So this is the schedule for the week, and today is going to be covered with VS setup and practices. So we'll go through a little bit of an overview of what VS is, what the use cases are, and the challenges that it will imply. And then we'll jump into building the actual level, talk about how you should prepare your meshes and how you should light it, and then different practices for doing look dev and polish. We'll then jump into talking about the different Pixitope actors that's essential for a virtual studio, and we'll jump into talking about some cool ways you can do transitions between set and within a set. We'll wrap all of this up with a cool way that you can combine both AR and VS and what you could use that for. And then we'll finish up with a Q&A in the end. So make sure that you write down those questions if there's anything at all that you are wondering about Pixitope or this session in general. So don't be shy, just throw out the questions there and we'll make sure to answer them at the end of this session. So let's jump into Pixitope. Let's see. Right now I'm starting with a completely empty level inside Pixitope. The only basic settings you need to make sure are enabled when you do virtual studios is in world settings. And then it's just to make sure that enable VS is turned on, and it usually is by default unless you have turned it off, so it shouldn't be a problem. And for VS, you also need to make sure that your input is set to internal keyer because virtual studios uses keyed video. So what is VS? VS is vertically virtual studio. It means that you have keyed video on top of graphics, and then can use for a number of use cases, including set extensions. It can be used to visualizing a real place that your talent needs to be in, but you don't really have access to actually physically being there. It can be used for explainers, such as Weather Channel did with their weather explainers, and various different analytics purposes where you can, excuse me, my mic is a little bit up there. Analytics where you can do various sports events or elections, where you can have live data fed into your project. So when it comes to challenges when doing virtual studios, is that obviously there are some specific equipment requirements. The most obvious one being the green screen, because you can't really do any keyed footage without the green screen unless you're doing some sort of video vol, but that's a little bit different. And it's important to have good light setup so you can light your green screen with even lighting and make sure that your talent stands out from the green screen. It's very important. And the camera should be white balanced and prepared beforehand before you set your key, otherwise it's not going to work out well. And the video signal for this camera should ideally be 4x4x4, but more realistically, it needs to be at least 4x2x2 because that's the, I believe, is the more common signal in most broadcast studios. So with that theory out of the way, we'll jump back into the editor. And you can see that we have our empty level with the camera root, the tracked camera, the material handler, and the post-process handler, which is the standard Pixotope actors that will be spawned with every level that you open. So we're gonna go, I'm gonna go, probably just me, I'm gonna go into blueprints, and I'm going to get some pre-prepared assets that we put into this project for the sake of saving time. So we have a couple of pre-assembled blueprints here. If I move this over, check the viewport. You can see it consists of several static meshes that are combined together. And some of them also have lights. So open this, you can see we have the meshes and we also have a number of spotlights. And this is usually not how we build our studios. It's mostly just for the sake of saving time in this session. So we're going to continue with dragging in our meshes. I'm just going to drag them in one by one here. Most of these are actually aligned properly with the pivot, so we can just zero out the location by hitting this little yellow arrow on the side here, reset to default, and it will snap to the correct position. So I'm going to bring in all the meshes here. And let's see, we have the floor, we have the upper stage. Bring these in. You can see that we have some detail lighting, but we'll light this properly with some more hero lighting afterwards. We're gonna position this. Some of these don't have the correct pivot points. So I'm just gonna move this up to make sure that they align. These props, I know that these lights are supposed to be underneath this ceiling right here. I'm just gonna move it forwards. And I know that these shelves on the side here should match up with the walls because they're supposed to hang on those walls. So let's see, move this up. We can all easily adjust this later if we need to. And finally, let's bring in the studio rig, which is just a collection of small girders and rigs just to make this look a little bit nicer. Obviously, this is not something you want to see in a real studio, but it's cool to have in a virtual one. Okay, so we have our basic meshes set in with some detail lights. So let's put in some hero lights so we can actually see what we're talking about here. So I'm going to bring in a skylight, and I'm going to set a cube map for this skylight because we already have a cube map prepared for it for this studio. So I'm going to go into my Pixotope Studio setup. And by the way, the Pixotope Studio and the other example levels can be downloaded when you have access to Pixotope Cloud. So feel free to download those and try it out. So I'm just going to go into my material library in this example studio and bring in, let's see, textures, and we have T Studio Cube HDR. So this is a 360-degree capture of our finished studio. So we can use that in the skylight to light our scene. Oh, looks like I didn't actually bring in the floor. Put this one to 3, light up a little bit. And we're going to go back to our blueprints and bring in our floor. And you can see that we have a little bit more lighting. We don't want the skylight to be too strong because it's going to wash out our image, and we want to be able to see some shadows and see some proper lighting happening. So we're going to set this one to maybe 2 for now. And like I said, the capture cube we're using is from the example studio. And how you would go about capturing this in Unreal is that you would use a scene capture cube. So what this scene capture cube is doing, And by the way, I'm hitting G to disable all widgets so I can just see what's happening. So the capture cube captures a 360-degree cube map from where you place it in your virtual environment. But you also need to make sure that it has a target. So I'm just going to right click and go to, let's see, materials and textures and add a cube render target. And this is the target this capture is going to render to. So now that I open it up, you'll see that we have a basic representation of this target. And as we move it around, it will update inside the texture file. So you can see that this one is pretty blurry, but you can capture high resolution for this. But this is just like a dynamic capture of this. So if you were to use this for a skylight, it is possible, but it's not recommended because it's actually capturing every frame. So what you can do when you're happy with the position of this is to right click it and create static texture. And that will create an HDR map for you like this. So that's what we did for this studio. I'm just going to put in, if I put this into the cube map for the skylight, you can see it's lighting it based on the environment. For now, I'm not going to use this because it's captured while I didn't have any lights in here basically, so it's a bit too dark. So I'll just stick with this studio capture that we have already because it looks a little bit better. So we have our skylights. So let's bring in a couple of hero lights and let's pretend that this is the position that we want to have our talent. So this is the place that we need to place our hero lights. And I can actually see now that this prop asset is not aligned properly with the ceiling. So I'm just going to bring that up a little bit. And still looking a little bit too dark to me, so I'm going to try to boost the skylight a little bit. It's a bit better. So, like I said, we want our talent to be on this middle podium here. So I'm going to go into content, once again, pick up studio and find some studio lights. You can light your scenes using the standard spotlights, which is actually what we're going to do. But what we like to do when lighting the scene is to have some actual light meshes casting that light. It's just good to dress your set that way because if there's a light source not coming from everywhere, it doesn't really look that great. So we're going to go into props and studio lights and bring in the studio light profile over here. And this is just a blueprint where we have a mesh of an actual studio light and then a spotlight in front of it. So if I move this one up, let's see. It looks like this one is still not aligned properly. Let's try to remedy that. Let's see. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. All right. So the studio rig actually needs to be moved forward a little bit. So let's see. That's better. I'm just going to align the studio light with this rig because that's what this rig is actually meant for, to hang lights. And because this is a blueprint, I can access all the components inside it, which are static meshes and lights. So we have the spotlight here. Not seeing a whole lot of things happening right now, so I'm going to increase the attenuation radius a little bit because it's saying that the light doesn't reach further than this radius right here. So I'm going to bring it up a little bit, increase the intensity, Let's see if we can move this one a little bit down. Actually, that was the light. We need to select the entire blueprint. I can see it's lighting it a little bit, but let's adjust the outer cone angle a little bit to sharpen it up. And see if we maybe need a higher value for this. There we go. So the outer and inner cone angle basically allows you to feather the edges of the spotlight. So you can see that we get a very hard edge when we have a very small distance between the two, and then we can feather out the light if we need to. Let's also bring in the studio light Fresnel because it looks a little bit different. And by the way, this is just so we have some nice assets to go with our lights. You can easily just bring in a regular spotlight and it will be the same type of light that we're using here. So let's once again bring in this spotlight here, give it a bit more boost. Adjust the attenuation radius and cone angles. Let's rotate the light a little bit. And there we go. Let's pretend that this is a good looking light setup. The final thing that we need to talk about when it comes to look deving your set is reflections, sorry. So we have the capture cube that we captured earlier. And we have something called a reflection capture. So a reflection capture basically allows you to have localized reflections from HDR images around your scene. So I can set this one to specified cube map. You can find something. Well, actually, I shouldn't use the studio because it's exactly the same as the rest. So I use this one. And I put this one in the position of this podium. And reflection captures needs to be built because they are not quite dynamic. They need to be built at the position. And you can see now that when I build it, take down the radius a little bit, you can see that it's actually adding the reflection from that desert HDR that we have here. And it's making a localized reflections inside the radius or inside the radius of this capture. And this is a good way if you need to fake kind of localized reflections. And you can also use these to capture the scene itself. So this is like an approximation because this is just a spherical reflection capture. It's just a cube map going into it. But we can use things like, let's see, planar reflections. Planar reflections are very nice looking reflections for flat surfaces. They will only work for flat surfaces, but they give you a very good like mirrored surface. They're not really physically accurate reflections because all they are doing is to mirror surfaces and basically just render the scene twice. So they are performance heavy, but they can be good if you need to have a good looking reflections for surfaces like floors or water surfaces. But it's not physically accurate, so you're not going to have control over things such as roughness and things like that. You kind of need to work around that. So I'm just going to bring up the screen percentage so we can have a little bit better, sharper image on it. And once again, if I hit G, you can see it actually renders on top of the materials that we have. So once again, G to disable previews and widgets. We can also do this manually inside the planar reflections by hitting show preview plane. And it will basically not render the entire thing. For planar reflections, it's good to optimize it because once again, it's rendering everything twice because it's kind of mirroring it. So a good way to optimize the planar reflections is go to primitive render mode and set it to use show only list. And that means that you can select which assets in the scene you want it to reflect. So in this case, I can choose the ceiling, and it will basically only, let's see, it's easier to see if we turn the preview plane back on. Now it's basically just rendering the ceiling in the planar reflections, and everything else that you see is coming from the skylight. That's the HDRI that the HDR capture that we put in earlier. So it's rendering that, but it's a lot lower resolution, and the planar reflection is only rendering the ceiling as a proper planar reflection, which is why it's the only one that looks very crisp and clean. Actually, Magnus, can you turn on the monitor over there? So that's planar reflections. Of course, if you're using ray tracing, you wouldn't need to worry about any of this because ray tracing gives you physically accurate reflections based on the roughness of the materials. Okay. You could, of course, use screen space reflections, but they are very inaccurate and they only render reflections from whatever you see on the screen at the time. So they are not ideal, but they can give you reflections for if you're in a pinch and you need some reflections. Screen space reflections will get you there. Now, so we have built our basic set. Now, we built this set using a variety of different 3D software because our artists likes different software. That's that's natural, but we it doesn't really matter what software you use to build these assets as long as it can produce an FBX. Of course, in version 4.24 of Unreal, I believe Epic is including Datasmith support, so you can actually work with that for the software that support Datasmith. And we will also support this in the next version of Pixtope. But it's important that when you build your sets that you have a kind of a game mindset when you do that. Make sure that your assets are optimized, because the most important thing about doing real-time rendering is to make sure it actually runs real-time, meaning that you need to hit the target frame rate of your broadcast, otherwise the graphics is not going to match up with the rest of it. So for this, I'm going to open up the level studio that we already have prepared in the example levels that you can get with Pixtope. So I'm going to bring up Pixapalooza and bring up the transition master. I'm not going to save any of this. We bring up our finished studio. So this studio that we set up, this one is very optimized because of the most important reason is because it has baked lighting. Baked lighting is very important when you're doing large sets like this, because if you have like hundreds of movable dynamic lights, that's gonna kill your performance. So for something like this, we bake the lighting and everything looks nice. Baked lighting will also give you proper global illumination, so it will look a lot better, but of course it's static. So you can have most of the scene baked with lighting, but some of them can be dynamic, like for example, these lights over here, because they are visible in the floor in reflections and such. They need to be dynamic. Yes. Once again, I'm talking about optimization. The assets that you bring in needs to be optimized. Don't spend too many triangles on a mesh if it's not necessary. Make sure that they are nice and clean. And if you're going to make lights, make sure that you make light maps. This can either be done in your external 3D package of choice, or Unreal can generate it automatically based on your texture UVs. And if I bring up the optimization view modes and go to light map density, you can see the resolution on these light maps. And this can either be set inside the asset itself. Let's search for a light map. You can choose for Unreal to generate the light map UVs. We haven't done that here because this one was created in the 3D package. Then you can do the light map resolution, which is by default pretty low. And the light map index is which UV slot does Unreal want to use as a light map. By default, it's channel number 1. But you can change this if your light map exists on one of the other UV slots. For this one, we're actually overridden the resolution. So if we search for light map inside the detail panel of this asset on the level, you can see we've set the light map resolution to 2K. I can demonstrate this by setting it back to 64. Actually, that wasn't the right asset. Oh, that was the wall. So this wall had a 2K resolution light map. By default, it's set to 64. That's pretty low. Usually it's not high enough, but for preview purposes, it's fine. And once again, light maps will optimize your scene because it means that most of these lights do not render in real time anymore. When it comes to assets, there are 2 main things to think about. And that is, don't go crazy on the polygon budget. Make sure that it's nice and optimized with not too many triangles. And the second one is not too many materials should be applied to it. This one has quite a lot because it's multiple meshes, like split up into multiple meshes because it's such a big studio. You can see that's multiple. I believe also this one has some empty material slots as well. So you can see it's just split up into various different materials. You should also make sure that your materials are not, if you have like duplicate materials, you should just make it into one material. So like if you have 2 parts that are both a chrome material, they should both be set as one material instead of just having 2 different materials rendering the exact same surface. Okay, so and sorry about this. I know it's a lot of theory to take in, and you artists out there probably thinking, oh, we already know this stuff, but it's important when it comes to rendering stuff in a real-time engine. So next up, we're going to talk about our Pixscope actors. So under world settings, we have this button called Auto Spawn Essential Actors. This one makes sure that the level spawns with the necessary Pixscope actors inside your level. And this being the tracked camera, which is obviously is your camera with the tracking data, the camera root, which the tracked camera is parented to and allows you to move your scene around because it moves the tracked camera. The camera root is offset from the tracked camera because this is the 0 point inside your tracking scene. So when you set up and calibrate in tracking, there will be a 0 point, and this 0 point is represented in this camera root. So the distance from the camera root to the virtual camera is the same as the distance between the real camera and the 0 point inside your scene. I hope that makes sense, but bottom line is that the camera root allows you to position your virtual scene anywhere that you want. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, how we can do some cool transitions and virtual cameras and such. The other 2 actors that Pixscope spawns by default is the material handler, which is used for shader compilation, and it shouldn't really be touched unless you really need to. And the post-process handler, which is our version of the post-processing volume inside Unreal. And this is the one that's actually talking to director. So when you do your post-processing effects, like effects and color grading, it's actually communicating with this post-process handler. Right. The very foundation of doing virtual studios inside Pixtope is our compositing plane. The compositing plane can be accessed inside the Pixtope tab and VS internal compositing plane. This plane is how you bring your video into your scene, basically. So what does this plane do? If we look through the tracked camera, you can see that we are matching the perspective of the real video with the virtual graphics. And if I move this compositing plane around, you can see that it's not really, it's not really moving the video around. It's only moving the frames around it. And that's because the video is projected from the point of view of the camera. So no matter where the compositing plane is, it will always look correct to the camera. And I can demonstrate this if I have the camera selected and just hit this pin right over here. You can see the preview from the camera. And I can, for example, I can rotate this like this. We always have a compositing plane on a 90-degree angle, and it looks really distorted inside the viewport, but as you can see, it looks correct inside the camera, except for the fact that it's actually cropping the feet, but that's because of the frame right here. So with that out of the way, bottom line is the compositing plane is basically projected from the camera point. Inside the compositing plane, we have a couple of features being we can cast virtual shadows. And if I bring in a point light, so we can actually see this a little bit better, you can see that it's casting a virtual dynamic shadows from the alpha of this compositing plane. So the better your key is, the better this is going to look, but there are some limitations to it. Now, one thing to note is that I don't have VisiVig enabled. If I enable VisiVig, you will see the live preview on the on this screen over here. And that allows me to work in real time. And you can see the same view that I'm seeing here on our output monitor. And you can also access these inside the optimization panel and going to output video fill. And this is your preview, and this will not be visible unless VisiVig is enabled. So you can see if I turn it off, it will just freeze the frame. Turn it on, it will be live again. A bit hard to see right now because obviously, as you can see, our very beautiful talent is an inimitable object, so it's not really moving. So not much we can do about that, I'm afraid, during these times. We need to make do with what we have. Next, we have rotate with camera, and this speaks basically self-explanatory. It makes the compositing plane rotate with the camera. Can you go and move the camera a little bit, Magnus, so we can just see what it's doing? So Magnus is just gonna wiggle the camera a little bit so we can actually see this working. It's actually parented to the camera root right now, so can you pan it even further, Magnus, just to see the effect of this? It's not actually. Oh, interesting. Okay, we'll look back at this a little bit later. Might be something weird going on. Okay, thank you, Magnus. So with the rotated camera, you have two modes, look at and view. And once again, we'll revisit this a little bit later. Then you have the horizontal and vertical pivot, and this is just for alignment of the compositing plane. And aligning the compositing plane is very important. If I go back to my slides a little bit, the compositing plane should match the distance as the real talent is to the real camera. So if possible, you can measure that distance and match that distance inside Unreal, or you can eyeball it, and I'll show you how you can do both. So if I go into Unreal again and hit this little maximize viewport, you can see that, let's see, we have this side view over here, and we have the camera. So we can hold down, let's maximize this. You can hold down middle mouse button, drag it over to the camera, and we get distance to the camera. This is obviously not like a perfect side view of this angle, because everything is kind of tilted a little bit. So you would want this to be perfectly flat, like a perfect profile view of the camera and the comp plane. Then you would get the correct distance by measuring it. But you can also do this by moving the comp plane back and forth. And hang on, let's see. Moving the comp plane back and forth until you see the feet start clipping through the ground. When the feet starts clipping through the ground, that means that it has the correct position. And you can see that the shadow is also matching up with the feet right now. So the main things to think about when doing this is that it's important to do this for a number of reasons. One is that the virtual shadows will only work if the position of the comp plane matches the position of the talent. So unless you have a third-party tracker, like for example, Stipe follower, that the talent has on him and can walk around freely, the talent should stay in the same position if you're going to use virtual shadows and virtual reflections, as well as getting accurate depth of field. And aligning it is one thing, but a quick way you can fix something like this, because you want the shadows to, if you feel that the shadows look a little bit floaty when basically your comp plane is not clipping through the ground, because basically you want to move it until just before it starts to clip to the ground, but it still looks like it's floating a little bit. So what you can do is use the mesh underneath it and convert that to a VS floor. And that means that the compositing plane will always render on top of that. So if I move it down now, you can see it's still rendering on top of it no matter what. And we can fine tune where the shadow is meeting the comp plane. But you shouldn't move it too far, otherwise the position is once again not going to match and the shadow is going to look like it's disconnected from the talent. Very cool stuff. Moving on, we let's see, let's check my notes here. Yeah, so the comp plane, by default, it's a plane, right? But it doesn't have to be a plane. You can replace all the static meshes inside the compositing plane to be another shape. So we have a couple of pre-made assets for this. One that's kind of an L shape and one that's kind of a cylindrical shape. And this is based on whatever shape your green screen might look like. Like this is a very typical green screen, like it's just a flat surface and curving down on the floor there, so you don't get a sharp edge. So we're going to try this one first. I'm going to move this one into the static mesh of that comp plane, and you can see that it replaced everything. Now if I move this down, now if I move this down now, you can see that it's predicting it. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong one. I need to make sure I select the root component, not any one of these, because that's going to move the components within the blueprint and not, sorry, and not the actual actor itself. So be careful of that. So I'm just going to deselect it again to make sure that it's actually doing what I want. Here we go. So as you can see, now it's now rendering the compositing plane on top. It's starting to distort it a little bit on the curved part here, but it will still look correct through the camera. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong button. Because once again, it's projected from the camera. And why would you use something like this? The main thing to take away with this is that if you want your camera to be able to move around your talent at a sharp angle, look what happens if I just rotate the camera root here to simulate this. Oh. If I rotate the camera around, you can see that as soon as we go to a sharp angle here, the video is going outside the borders of the comp plane. So how we can remedy this is to use, either you can use multiple comp planes or you can use that custom shape that we talked about. So I can bring in this cylinder shaped mesh instead. Scale that up a little bit so we have some more range to work with. And ideally, these shapes should match your green screen as much as possible. So you can see now that if I once again rotate my camera root, we have a lot more range to work with, as you can see. So if you want your camera to be able to rotate around the talent, you can use custom shapes, or you can duplicate the compositing planes. So if I just delete this compositing plane and make a new one, like that, we're back, and we can duplicate this by holding down Alt and drag, rotate it. And once again, if we rotate the camera root and you look through the camera, you can see that it gives us a lot more range, looks strange in the viewport, but looks fine through the camera. All right. So we talked about the compositing plane and what it's doing. So let's talk a little bit about garbage masks, or garbage mat, as it's called here. They are basically very quick masks that you can use on your talent. So you can mask out if you look at the, I'm always putting the wrong way. So if you look at the output, you can see that I'm able to mask out my talent using these garbage masks. And they can be any shape that you want. Once again, like the comp plane, I can set this one to be a cube, and we have a 3D object masking out the talent. Very cool. All right, so we have talked a little bit about how you use the comp plane and what it's for. We're going to move on to showing you some cool transitions and how you can use the camera root to do virtual camera moves and move around to various sets. And also going to do some cool transitions. After that, we're going to jump into live mode and see how we can control all this from Director and talk about how we can use the various settings for the compositing plane and how we can use color grading and so forth. So first of all, let's talk about virtual camera moves. I have a couple of blueprints inside this level, one called BP, virtual camera. I have one called virtual camera animated and virtual camera static. So let's use the static one first. This is my tracked camera. And this is a static cine camera inside the scene. You can find this on the Pixel virtual camera. This is just a camera that has this static position. So if I go into this blueprint, and by the way, Frank will cover the virtual camera moves blueprints in more detail tomorrow, but I'll just show you how it works right now. So what it's doing is that it's taking this specific pixtope node inside this blueprint, and it's basically just saying how long time do you want to blend into the other camera, and what function you want to use for blending, what kind of interpolation, and then copy settings from track to make sure that the virtual camera has the same transforms and focal length as the real camera. You can turn this one off if you need to. And if I enable preview live mode, use the static camera, and I hit this one, switch to camera, you can see we have a blend time of 5 seconds. And for a static camera like this, that means that it's the amount of seconds the camera move is going to be. If I hit this, you can see we are outside of the tracked camera and it's flying out of it. And that took 5 seconds. I set this one to maybe 1 second. It will be super quick. I set it to 10 seconds and it will be a very slow camera move. And all it's doing, once again, is just interpolating between the position of this camera and this camera. So that's the most basic way you can set up a virtual camera move. But you can also use level sequences to do animated cameras. And this one is basically doing the exact same thing, except it's also playing a sequence. And that sequence is animating the virtual camera. So you can see this one right here. That one is animating the virtual camera. What this one is going to do is that it's going to blend into that animation. So if I go into live mode again and find a virtual camera, we have this PX animated camera trigger. This one, the blend time doesn't need to be as long because we actually want to see some of the animation as well. So I'm just going to put this to 3 seconds, hit this one, and it's going to interpolate over to the position and then animate the sequence. And this gives you a bit more flexibility in doing some more complex camera moves. Okay. We also have some preset blueprints that you can use for virtual camera moves, which are a part of our event system, virtual camera sequence. But this one will be covered tomorrow with Frank. So I'm not going to cover them now, but these preset blueprints will basically allow you to more easily create multiple camera moves at ease without having to set up the logic yourself. Right, so we have a couple of other transitions that we can do using the camera route. For example, we can do a scale. So I have a blueprint here called route scale. If I enable live mode and hit the route scale, this one will scale down the scene. So we get kind of a miniature talent. And we can also set the scale based on this parameter right here. So it is something a lot smaller. Actually, it's going to scale back up when I hit it again because this one is a toggle button. So I hit it back down again and it's scaling down even more into the carpet. So there's very simple logic happening inside this. It's basically just saying it's using this animation from 0 to 1 in a matter of 3 seconds. It's animating this camera route scale from a certain size. So we set the size from this variable right here, it's at 0.25. And by default, we can set this inside the blueprint itself if we need it to change. Once again, the camera route is what's positioning your scene, and because the camera is parented to the camera route, and we can also parent the compositing plane to the route, which means that when we move the camera, by the way, I have a target point right here for just to make some of this logic work, but it's basically just a parent, the camera route is just parented to that target point. It's basically just moving the exact same thing as the camera route with an offset. So if I move this target point or the camera root around, you can see that you can position your scene anywhere that you want. Very easy to position your scene. And this can, of course, be animated as well. Finally, we are going to talk a little bit about level streaming. This one is a master level, meaning that it's streaming in multiple levels. And the only thing that's included in the master level is all the logic, all the pixel actors, and all the utilities that you need to run your scene. But all the geometry and lighting is actually included inside these streaming levels. So by default, it's the studio that's streaming in. You can do some cool transitions when you have both of those levels streaming in by making a blueprint and hitting the transition. And this will change the set, load the set, and we have a completely different environment. I can set it back to tracked camera. By the way, this blueprint also jumped into a virtual camera mode when I did that. So when I hit this again, you can see that the camera is also animating up to a different position so we can get a better view of this beautiful set. And we can move back to the tracked camera again using this switch to tracked. So that is level streaming. It's a very good idea to work with levels this way. If you have a very complex project and you need to streaming a lot of various different levels, you do it like this with a master level, and then you stream in all the sub levels here. And the sub levels shouldn't really include anything, any logic or any pixels of actors. They should exist inside the master level. And how you would go about doing this is that you can create a new level here or add existing. You can just select the level that you want to stream in and add it in there. Very cool stuff. Okay, so now that we have our basic scene set up, let's jump a little bit into live mode. So I'm just gonna hit this, see if there's anything else we need to save. Oh, no. I'm gonna save that, yes. So we'll jump into Director and we'll launch this project in live mode. And remember, live mode renders everything with the full performance and the best quality possible without the overhead of the interface in the editor. And this is what you want to use when your broadcast goes live. So let's talk a little bit about how you can adjust your composite. So I go to Production and Composite. We can see that we are currently in video space, but coming new now with Pixel 1.2 is linear compositing space, which is way more physically accurate and looks a lot better. For now, we're just going to use video space because we are not looking at proper HDR monitors. So you have a couple of settings inside this panel. You can adjust various things like light wrap and shadows, and this is mostly meant for AR stuff, so it's not applicable to this. But if I go into video, we have a couple of settings for the comp plane. So we can add light wrap for the comp plane itself. And you can see that we can add some basic light wrap to our composite. Very cool. And we also have some feathering options, which I'm actually going to enable this show preview color so it's more easy to see it. I'm going to go back to video now and let's actually zoom this out a little bit so it's a bit easier to see. And if I turn on feather, I'm actually just going to jump out of track mode to more easily see this. So and we have zoomed out from the tracked camera, you can see we have some feathering happening on the edges of the comp plane. And this is basically used to have a smooth transition. If your talent needs to walk outside the comp plane and you don't want it to be a hard edge, you can use the feathering to remedy that. And once again, sorry, I didn't tell you, but to jump or to basically hijack the tracked camera, in line mode, you hit F10. Hitting F10 again will jump it back to the tracked camera position, and hitting F10 will move the tracked camera around. In line mode, you can only do this with the tracked camera. In editor, you can actually jump out of the tracked camera. This is actually just taking the tracked camera and moving the position of that around. So that was the composite. Under effects, we have obviously effects that you can enable, such as chromatic aberration, lens flares, dirt mask, vignetting. This is also where you would enable the screen space reflections and the screen percentage. We can also enable bloom, which will give us a little bit of a nicer feel. If I jump out of the tracked position again, you can see that we have some. I'm actually just going to disable the compositing plane for now, so it's not disturbing us. Let's see, objects. If you go into the objects tab, by the way, you can get access all the objects inside the project. I'm going to find the compositing plane, adjust it, and just turn off the visibility. Just gonna quickly disable something. Let's see. What we were talking about right now was bloom. So you can see when I enable bloom, we'll get some nice bloom on the lights. Increase the intensity of this, or we can switch it to convolution bloom, which looks a lot better. Next, we have bloom for the video itself, but for this to work, you obviously need to have the comp plane visible and you need to have a strong light behind it, which we currently don't do. But this is where you would enable bloom for your video. So I'm just going to bring my compositing plane back in. Let's see. Turn on the visibility, put tracked camera back where it's supposed to be. And finally, we have color grading. Oh. So this looks a little bit different from the colors of the actual scene. So we can color grade it a little bit to try to match the color tones a little bit better. Just the white balance and the tint, just to have something that matches our scene a little bit better. Maybe add a little bit of contrast, tiny bit. I can also color grade the graphics individually, as well as the final output if you so need it. Okay, so how are we on time right now? We're doing fine. So that's how you can jump into live mode. Remember, live mode is always what you want to jump into when going when your broadcast is going live, and everything will be operated from this director panel. You can also, when you are in live mode, you can also switch levels on the fly. So if I turn off this star right here, so I'm not filtering levels based on favorites, I can just switch to level. I can, for example, select this fixed up exterior level and just hit switch to level. And it will take a little while, but it will switch to that level inside the project without having to close the other one. Probably should have selected a different level because I don't think this one is compiled. So let's see, I can just close that, and we'll actually, let's see, we'll open up the same level again, once again in live mode. All right, so here we are. Let's see. And once again, let's try a different level that we can switch to. So let's switch to this, well, it's the same level basically, so it should, but for example, we can switch to this one, for example. So I'm just going to switch the level, select all, switch. And just like that, we switch to another level. This is very easy to do when you are in live mode. All right. So we're going to jump back into the editor now to show some cool ways that you can map video to objects inside your scene. So I'm going to launch this level in the editor again. Okay, so let's see. What we're going to do right now is to bring in a monitor, a virtual monitor. So you can bring in both live video to Pixel actors and, oh, sorry, not Pixel actor. You can bring in live video to any actor inside the project, and you can also bring in regular videos from disk. So this one, just going to remove that. We're going to add the BP media video component. And this component maps the video to your scene. So you have two options that you need to change on this. It's the material slot and the media index. Materials slot corresponds to which material slot on this asset do you want to map the video to. In this case, is element number 1, because this is the one that's for the screen. The other one is for the frame around it. So if I select this and set the material slot to 1, and then the media index, this is going to match the spigot on your card. So if I go to routing inside director, and maybe we can add another input. So I'm going to add the AR camera. Sorry, I'm going to, mine is going to come out. Video IO, another one. Oh yeah, I'm going to have to go to video IO and add another input, which is going to be input media, and go to routing and add an input on this one, add the media input that we created, and set this one to spigot number 1, I believe. 1 or 2. Yep. All right, so we have assigned a spigot. That means that spigot number 1, and the media index is saying spigot number 1. So now if we go to live mode, hit eject camera, so we can move outside the camera, you can see that we have a live input. And now mine is moving the camera as well, so we can actually see that. Very cool. And this can also be added to other meshes, like for example, this one has only one material. You can still add the BP media video component. And this one doesn't really have more than one material, so it should work out of the box. You can see that it's mapped to the surface of this cube. Very cool stuff. Now, we're going to look at how you can use our text meshes a tiny bit. So our text meshes are very easy to use 3D text. It comes with Pixeltope. So you have a couple of options for adjusting the geometry of these. You can add materials, so you can find some good materials for these. You can search for Chrome. Just gonna put some on the various parts of the text. You can see that. So you have control over the bevel size and all those various geometry settings. And you can also switch out the font and of course the phrase like this. But this is like, it's not too interesting inside the editor itself. So if we go into the control panel, sorry, we need to create a control panel. Go into control and create a control panel, call this one text, create that. We'll go over the control panel in more detail in a later session, by the way, but this is just to demonstrate the text itself. So you can go to the toolbox and add the text widget. And just hit right click, edit action. And we're just going to find the text mesh that lives inside our scene. Select that. And we can give it a default text and a character limit. That already says Pixeltope. But if I say my control panel, didn't actually add the action to it. Let's see, select text. See, maybe we need to reread this scene. Let's see, reread. Okay, so we might have to revisit this a little bit later. But this is basically how you would be able to change text on the fly from the director control panel. Finally, now we're going to talk about how we can do AR and VS inside the same scene. So I have a couple of slides for this. I mean, only 2 slides, but anyway. So what does AR plus VS mean? What can you use it for? So in a nutshell, AR renders graphics on top of video and VS renders video on top of graphics. So what if you had the ability to combine these two? Well, guess what? We do. So this means that you have a combination of these two would give you some unique possibilities. Like it means that the talent can be both on top and underneath the graphics, as long as you have a green screen. And a talent can also seamlessly walk between a real set and a virtual one. As you can see in this example from the production of our very good friends over at Donghua, you can see that these golf players are walking on top of the AR graphics, as well as this flag, and it's keyed out because the grass is green. So we're able to put AR graphics on top of everything, but also able to put talent and significant objects on top of the AR graphics. So with our current studio setup right now, it's not really possible to demonstrate this in a good way, but I'll show you how you can set this up. So if I hide this monitor and just bring in a cube, for example, because we're gonna use some AR utilities to be able to do this. First of all, you just go to world settings and make sure that you enable AR. So now we have both AR and VS enabled. And if I scale this cube up now, so it covers this kind of wall back here. right click and convert this one to a holdout, which Frank talked about during the AR session, it will actually show the video back there. But because the camera is kind of pointing over there, it doesn't really show it. But if I, let's see, if I move everything over here, you can see that we have the video. Let's see, we have the video behind here as the background, but we also have the compositing plane on top. So if we look through the camera, you can see it's rendering both behind and in front of the graphics. Once again, it's a little bit hard to demonstrate this with our current setup, but this is a very great example of how this can be utilized. So let me just check my notes here so I haven't forgotten anything. So I think that's it for setting up VS. So I think we're going to move into the Q&A. So if you have questions, please write them down, type them in, and we'll answer them for you. I'll give you 5 minutes now to think about questions that you're wondering about and kind of just get around, think about what you've just learned and see if we have any questions to answer, and we'll come back here in 5 minutes. So it's 6:13 right now, so we come back at 6:18. So we are back, ready to answer some questions. So I'm just going to give you one more minute just to gather around, make sure that you have all the questions you wanted to ask written down. All right, so let's get into some questions. So let's see. How long did it take them, us, to finish that virtual studio? Well, it took about 70 to 80 man days, couple of months, but we were working with that studio in addition to other things. So yeah, a couple of months, but probably would have been shorter if we only focused on building that particular studio. Next question, can I have 2 real camera shots and cut between them and add virtual camera flights to that? Yes, absolutely. Pixel is generally 1 camera per render engine. The main way we use virtual camera moves is by blending from the tracked camera to the virtual camera, as I demonstrated. And then animating virtual camera to a new position, and then blending into the new position of that tracked camera. We then typically move the camera route to the new position, so the talent is already waiting there. And you can use this method in many ways, but the most basic use cases will be covered tomorrow when we do a more deep dive into virtual camera moves. I'm curious about setting up multiple cameras within the VS scene. Is that something will be covered tomorrow? Yes, that is correct. That's going to be covered tomorrow during the session with Frank. For a VS, for a virtual studio where we see the virtual lights change dramatically in intensity and color, would you set up the level to use all dynamic lights or a combination of both dynamic and static? Also, is there a way for the virtual lights to dynamically affect the talent lighting? Okay, so let's answer the first question first. So it depends on how you want, what kind of lights you want to be dynamic. It depends on the use case. So for this particular studio, like I said, we have most of the lights being static and baked, but for the lights that has specific purposes, like, for example, these lights over here, that needs to be visible in bloom and post-processing effects like that, we need to use dynamic lights. So it really depends on your scene, but for optimization purposes, we do recommend that you don't leave all your lights dynamic unless you absolutely have to. And second question is, also, is there a way for virtual lights to dynamically affect the talent lighting? Not currently, but it will be in the next version of Pixdope. Why do you have 2 channels on UV sets? I mean, one is for the build light cache, but the UVs are different. Why? Okay, so this is because you need UVs for your textures as well, because all 3D objects have textures. Sorry, my mic is popping a little bit again. So if I jump into one of my assets, again, let's do this studio floor. Jump into this, and we have the 2 UV channels. So this first slot is for the textures themselves. And you can see that they are overlapping. That's because we have multiple materials. So one material would have one clean UV set, and UV channel 1 is all of those materials packed into one non-overlapping UV slot like this. So the reason for why you have to have two is you need one to bake the lighting, and you need one for the actual textures themselves. And the reason why they look different is because that light maps usually are lower resolution, and they can't overlap. So you need to make sure you have a lot more padding between the UV islands, just to make sure that there's not any overlap of the baked lighting. Because if this was a really small texture, like say 64 by 64, then one pixel will basically be able to bleed up over multiple parts of the UVs, and that would give you artifacts. So next question is, what is the suggested size of the green screens to use a studio of the size you are showing us? Well, the size of your green screen should accommodate the cameras you require and the angles you wish to shoot at. Obviously, our green screen studio is a little bit too small, so we don't have that much flexibility. But once again, this will greatly depend on what kind of production you're going to run. It doesn't really depend on the size of the studio, because this is all a virtual space that you can utilize how you want. So it all depends how you want to move the camera around the real talent. Next question, the text layer you showed. How can you make more lines and formatting? The 3D text plugin does not currently support line breaks, and nor does it have any built-in logic for formatting and adjusting kerning to fit the text within, say a text field or on a graphics. However, all of this can be fairly easily be built inside the blueprints. Next question, what about flickering? When you rotate the camera, the plane with the key talent start to flicker. I know that was streaming, or it really was flickering. What if I animate the camera to make a panned movement? So this is because I demonstrated this by moving the camera route. You can see when I move the camera route around, we can sometimes get a little bit of flickering because we're kind of shuffling everything around. But this does not happen when you pan the real camera, nor does it happen when you do virtual camera moves. What would be a configuration be like for joint use with Ultimate and external chroma key? Pixelop supports both. Key fill both in and out. Yeah, so I think that's it for the questions. So I hope you all had fun today learning about virtual studios. Thank you so much for sticking along with me for this long, and I hope you are excited to come back to Pixelop tomorrow, where Frank is going to go more in depth about project controls, virtual cameras, level sequences, and how you can interface that into the director control panel. He's also going to cover the event system and logic, as well as wrapping that up with some nice dive into data integration, which gives him very cool opportunities to get live data into your projects. So I hope that you all are excited for that tomorrow, and I wish you a very good day, and thank you so much for watching.